Thank you. Well, good afternoon. I'm really delighted to be here. My name is Barbara Lange. I'm the principal and CEO of Kaibo 121, and I want to thank Dan, Jermaine, and Bill Bagalar for including me in today's session. Just briefly, Kaibo 121 is a boutique consultancy focused on guiding media technology companies in taking practical steps on their path to sustainability. I launched this initiative just in 2022 after 12 years as the executive director of SMPTE, the Global Professional Association that supports technical framework and the professional community in quality motion imaging. As I was thinking about my next move, I decided to focus on a topic that I was hearing a lot about over the years. Climate change is happening and the data proves it, but I hadn't seen much happening within the media sector, and more specifically in media technology. So I launched Kaibo 121 as an advisor to those organizations who want to have a sustainability plan but have no idea where to start, and we can help guide them in making adjustments that bring real change and have a lasting impact. You might be wondering about this image. It's a close-up view of Mount Kilimanjaro, if anybody knows that, the tallest mountain in Africa. I named my company after the largest crater, Kaibo, and on the date that my husband and I summited in 2006 on January 21st. And I found the name and image really appropriate for a firm looking at sustainability, as the mountain's famous glacier is a symbol of the impact of a changing climate. Like any industry, there are a multitude of acronyms and organizations that it's hard to keep track, and I hope that by the end of this presentation you'll have a better understanding of the construct of sustainability. It really all starts with the UN Sustainability Development Goals, which the UN's IPCC report on. These are the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, based on protocols that are agreed upon, including greenhouse gas protocols and the SBTI, Science-Based Target Initiatives. Then you have the NDC partnership, which is the agreement among nations to report on their progress through their nationally determined contributions. All of this leads to net zero, which is the holy grail of sustainability. And we haven't even started talking about carbon capture, repurposing, and all of those good things. The term sustainability came into vogue in the 80s, and we often, or at least I do, think of it as focus on climate change and the environmental concerns, but it's much more than that. In fact, sustainability is described as the intersection of social, economic, and environmental concerns. Sustainability means recognizing that ending poverty and other deprivations goes hand in hand with strategies that improve health and education, reduce inequality, and spur economic growth, all while tackling climate change and environmental issues. Therefore, sustainability encompasses such important corporate responsibility issues alongside diversity, equity, and inclusion, and social justice causes. The UN's the best way to understand the overall notion of sustainability is starting with the UN Sustainability Development Goals, often known as the 17 SDGs, which are target-specific goals around those social, economic, and environmental sustainability concerns. These 17 goals are the basis of the many reports and scientific studies that drive sustainability discussions. Often you hear them in the mainstream media. And when you look at these goals, you can see that they encompass issues of well-being, including poverty, zero hunger, quality education, and gender equality. They also cover issues around infrastructure, clean water, and of course they talk about issues related to the environment, from water to affordable and clean energy, and also climate, specifically climate action. And when you do look at climate action, this happens to be the deeper dive into number 13, which really is the one that we hear the most about, but it's only one of the 17 of the SDGs. So a little bit deeper now into I'm sure you've all heard about the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was a milestone global effort passed in 2015. It's the target that drives much of those SDGs that I mentioned previously. The biggest challenge is the race to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. The original target of 2 degrees centigrade was established during those 2015 discussions, and in 2018 the metric was adjusted based on current state of conditions. So quite honestly, we're not anywhere near where we should be. These metrics are monitored and reported out by the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And often when you hear about them in the press, that is the report that you're hearing about. As agreed upon, over 190 countries implemented signed on to the agreement, and that requires scientifically driven economic and social transformation. The Paris Agreement works on a 5-year cycle of increasingly ambitious climate action carried out by these countries, and each of the signing countries are required to submit their plans for climate action known as the Nationally Determined Contributions, or the NDCs, which taken together mark the progress towards these agreed targets. I can slow down now, I think. I'm getting warm because, since, as you can see, since the 50s, the planet has seen a steady increase in the global temperature change. Much of this, so much so that we're already past the point of meeting the Paris Agreement targets. The post-war population expansion, the increase in manufacturing, the general lack of attention to environmental issues in that period all contribute to the increase in the global temperature. And this is scientific data. This isn't fake news. So are we on track? In order to keep the global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade, emissions need to be reduced by 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. Based on the IPCC reports, commitments made by governments to date fall far short of what is required. In fact, the current national climate plans, again, all the countries signing on to the Paris Agreement, would lead to not a decrease, but in fact, an increase of almost 14% in global greenhouse emissions by 2030 compared to 2010 levels. So we're not on the right track. Getting to net zero requires all governments, including the biggest emitters, to significantly strengthen their nationally determined contributions and to take bold, immediate steps towards reducing emissions now. The Glasgow Climate Pact, which was part of the Glasgow event in November 2021, called on all countries to revisit and strengthen the 2030 targets by the end of 2022 in order to stay in alignment with the Paris Agreement temperature goal. We know the warnings are dire, and the call to action is for all industries. After lunch, that's a downer, I'm sure. But remember, so a little bit shifting gears in terms of what emissions are and how to compare them. So remember in the 1990s when all the talk was about the ozone layer? I almost forgot about that myself. But back then we were talking about eliminating aerosols and freon and other things that contribute to the breakdown of the ozone layer, and we accomplished a lot. Today, when we talk about greenhouse gases, we talk about the 7 greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change, most notably carbon dioxide and methane, but also nitrous oxides, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride, and nitrogen trifluoride. These are collectively referred to as greenhouse gases, or GHG, and oftentimes when you hear about CO2 emissions, it's really the collective of all of these gases. And as you take a look at this particular chart, which comes from the U.S. EPA, transportation and electricity contribute to over 2/3 of the greenhouse emissions. So you might think, well, the focus on electric vehicles do have a positive impact on the emissions over fossil fuel vehicles. But as you can see, electricity still relies is still a big component of the emissions, and they rely heavily on fossil fuels to power them. So that while you are not emitting CO2 or greenhouse gases from your own vehicle, you're not necessarily contributing to the bigger picture. You're making a big step, but it's still more to go. When we look at this in a slightly different context, here now the research from the Carbon Trust, we now begin to look at the different industries that are contributing to global greenhouse gases. And I wanted to dig into deeper to find out where media and entertainment finds itself. And the best place, or the closest match I could find, was in what's called the ICT sector information and communications technology. And as you can see here, according to the Carbon Trust, it's composed of data centers, data transmission networks, and the user devices that make up the greenhouse gas emissions. Most of it, interestingly enough, being on the user device side. So when you look at carbon CO2 comparisons, what does that really mean, right? So I said, well, what does that mean? I went out looking on the famous, as I like to call it, the interweb, to find out what are the, some markers. So a coffee, I'm not going to say it's a Starbucks coffee, but this research showed that a coffee brewed from cradle to grave represents about 0.209 kilogram of CO2 emissions. Okay, so whoever's drinking a cup of coffee, that's what you're contributing. How many are you drinking a day, right? How about a 4-ounce burger, a quarter pounder? Again, I'm not saying it's a Burger King burger, but in general, just in terms of scaling, is almost 10 kilograms of carbon emissions. And that's mainly because it's very carbon heavy or energy heavy to sustain agriculture and feeding beef cattle, as it turns out. So I'm sure you've heard a lot about that in the news. Now, if you look at a vehicle, let's look at a regular old car that uses gasoline, not electricity, and now you're talking 5.6 tons of CO2. So this just gives you a scale so you can have an awareness of what your contribution is as you travel through and do what it is that you do on a daily basis. How many of you ride a bicycle to work? I know it's LA. All right, one, yay. How many of you have electric vehicles? One, same guy. Interesting. He's on a trend. Is that John? Well, that's good. He's walking the walk. These are the things that I think, over time, this is the point of the exercise, really, because you don't know what you don't know, and as you know more, you can make better decisions. As we look into media and entertainment, and this may be data that you've also seen, now you can take a look at what the carbon emissions are on a typical production for a television show versus film production. Now, I mean, lots of factors go into this, but to suffice it to say that the bigger the production, the most likely the bigger the carbon footprint is going to be, because you have more cameras, you have more filming locations, all of these things contribute to the carbon footprint. But it just gives you now some scale between the coffee cup and your business on the lot, and how you can make decisions about those various situations. When you look at greenhouse gases now, we talk a lot about net zero. Well, what exactly does net zero mean? So net zero is getting to a completely carbon neutral place. And it means that you have to measure your carbon emissions and your greenhouse gas emissions. And there is the concept of 3 scopes of greenhouse gas emissions. And understanding that is pretty vital to understanding exactly what your net zero is. So if a company that you're working for or doing business with says they're net zero now, really, are they? Is it the full scope 3 net zero, or just maybe scope 1 or possibly scope 2? So let's take a look. These are defined by the Science-Based Target Initiative, and there are 3 scopes measuring carbon emissions to determine your carbon footprint. Companies can reduce scope 1 and 2, as I'll mention in a moment, by improving operational efficiencies, and you're going to hear a little bit more about that from my next speaker. But scope 3 is the really tough one, because it is talking about the full value chain, supply chain up and down, and depends on the company's activities in that respect. So when we look at scope 1, these are the direct emissions from the company. They're most easily identified because you do get a utility bill, for example. So you can understand how much energy you're using for your business. This also takes into account on-site manufacturing, industrial processes, your computer, your data centers, your own facilities, and your on-site transportation and company vehicles, for example. This one is pretty easy to I mean, I won't say it's easy, but you can measure your Scope 1 with some accuracy, and many organizations are doing that. Scope 2 now is where this is considered the indirect emissions from the generation of the energy that drives your business. So it is the energy that you're buying to run your business, whether it's for electricity, for heating, cooling, whatever you're using. And where are those energy sources coming from? Are they renewable sources of energy, non-renewable, or a mixture of the two? Again, something that you can measure because you are getting bills for these sorts of activities. But when you get to Scope 3, which is where it really gets tricky, this is what is called the measuring the indirect emissions that occur up and down the value chain. These occur from the your customers as well as your suppliers. And obviously, these are often very difficult to measure. You have to have relationships with, you have to have an understanding and the data points of those ends of the value chain, and you have to have a good understanding of reliable data from those vendors to ensure that you're measuring properly. Interestingly enough, Scope 3 emissions are estimated to be about 5.5 times more than the emissions of Scope 1 and 2. So this is really the hardest nut to crack. It does include things like employee commuting or business travel, purchased goods and services, the use of your products, and the distribution of your products. And if you look at just an example here that I found the S&P produced, the details don't really matter except the colors. So the dark and light green are the Scope 3. And you can see in all of these industries, except for utilities, the vast majority of the emissions for any of these industries is Scope 3. And so it's really a challenge. So when somebody says that they're net zero, you really want to ask the question, are you really net zero, or where on the spectrum are you net zero? So the math to net zero is, in effect, a pretty straightforward equation, though it's not so easy to achieve. It's a matter of decreasing your Scopes 1, 2, and 3 carbon emissions while you increase your carbon removal, capture, or to get to a true state of net zero. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that second part of the equation, but suffice it to say that there's a lot of research, interesting research right now about carbon capture and recycling and recovery so that carbon can actually be used as a raw material for useful products. So the innovation in this space is really amazing as organizations are learning, for example, next to a coal-powered power plant, taking the resulting CO2 emissions and pumping them into greenhouses that are right next to the power plant facility to effectively recycle. So that is something that actually is not new research, but is something that's interesting and coming to closer to fruition now. So when we look at sustainability in media and entertainment, we know that a lot of organizations, public companies, are presenting themselves as green because they're taking sustainability efforts into their on-set productions using e-vehicles, battery-operated generators, and so on. But then we also have private companies. Private companies are usually the small to mid-sized media tech companies who have no mandate to do anything about sustainability. And that's a problem because we should all care about this topic. These are companies that may view sustainability efforts as an added expense. So what's the economic value proposition to adopt a new method of work? The U.S. is well behind other countries in terms of enforcing or regulating. The EU is mandating, for example, that sustainability across the value chain, and it is requiring that public companies report on their sustainability efforts as part of their financial quarterly reports. In the U.S., the SEC recently announced an open comment period on a proposed rule change that would do exactly the same thing, so we'll see if those things will change. When we look at the, the workflow, a nod to movie labs, I'm going to talk about this briefly in the breakdown of the workflow of content creation, content manipulation, and content distribution, just to talk briefly about the where we are in terms of progress. If you look at content creation, of course, that's what's happening here on the lot. It's the recording of content, whether it's in the studio or broadcast, live, recorded, traditional, virtual. It's all the things that is happening to create the content. And I would say that we've got this pretty well in check. There are organizations like Albert out of the UK, the Green Production Guide here in the US, which I know Sony is part of, and other organizations who are looking after this so that you can determine that you're a green production. When we get into the second phase here, manipulation, where we're talking about editing and processing of the content, all the things that we heard about earlier this morning, in fact, things in the cloud, data centers, the spaghetti of workflows, all of that is, complicated and takes a lot of energy to process and get to the final product. And here I would say we're in a mishmash of whether we understand that or not. A lot of vendors say that they can give you the data that you want, but is it reliable? Is it transparent? Is it consistent across vendors? When we get down to content distribution, this area research is really growing, and in fact, a group out of the UK called the Greening of Streaming recently did an analyzation of an energy consumption of streaming a pro football match in the UK to really identify and understand the heat map of the use of what the consumer's use of energy as they are streaming that content. And the goal with that research is to identify gaps that industry can collaborate on to solve, and including identifying roles for standards and protocols. So it also depends on what kind of content you're delivering. If you're delivering SD versus HDR, 4K versus the next great thing, bit rates, compression, all of these things matter and contribute to the energy consumption. I would say that we're also getting closer to some things here, but not really quite where we need to be. As we look at the drivers for sustainability, the drivers include government regulations, and as I mentioned, the EU is much further ahead than we are. Some estimates say it's about 5 years ahead. So the EU already, as I say, requires publicly held companies to disclose their sustainability. And so far, as we know, the U.S. government has not found consensus in at least the President Biden's current Build Back Better agenda, which would impose stiffer regulations. So there's no sign in the future. Investors with an ESG focus include private equity firms are also driving the decisions for companies. Here, however, there is also a concern because there are no global standards for how disclosures are measured and the way companies are evaluated on an ESG index. So these can vary widely, and it makes it very difficult for investors to know what's what. So there's room for improvement there. And finally, I would argue that the workforce will begin making demands that the companies they work for and have a strong position, not just in words, but in actions around ESG. Research shows the millennial workforce is keenly focused on ESG issues and seem to be making buying and career choice decisions based on their company's performance in this domain. Ultimately, it's important that sustainability is not an afterthought, but that it is something that is part of the planning process and integral into business decisions. There is a lack of data sets, there's a lack of standards, there's a lack of agreeable measurement methods, there's a lack of carbon disclosure methods, transparency, and probably worst of all is this notion that carbon offsets is real. It's probably more greenwashing than anything. But with this comes opportunity and hope. There is a lot of research. There are several organizations, a lot of it coming out of the UK, that I can point you to that are doing research in this domain. There are various tools. I would like to say that organizations like mine and Humans Not Robots are here to help. And there are various organizations in the industry who are actually actively looking at this. Awareness of the issue is how to tackle it. And everyone has a part to play, since everyone is someone else's scope 3. And what we need are more studies to dive deeper into the media tech sector. There's lots of data out there about sustainability efforts of industries like transportation, agriculture, and others, but we don't really understand completely with measurable metrics against industry standards how media technology sector works. So in closing, yes, I am closing, I wanted to point out that the push to better understanding of sustainability issues relies on awareness within the industry, but also among consumers. And we see it all the time. How many of you remember when we started seeing calorie counts for fast food locations? This was in May 2018 when the FDA began requiring restaurants of more than 20 locations to be required to show calorie counts on the menus. I hate it. But the research, who else hates that? But the research shows that it does have an impact on the choices you make. So more than that, the sustainability requires more awareness at the personal level. So for example, my utility company back in New York, Con Ed, installed a smart reader on our meter at our house, and it synced with an app on my phone. So I can see for the first time our household's daily energy consumption, understanding where and also understanding where our energy sources are coming from. This tool also incents us to use power more responsibly to help the power grid during those high energy consumption periods, such as those hot, humid days in July and August, or an icy cold winter's day in January. And I know you all here in California have to deal with the power grid a lot. How many of you have something like this at home? John, you need one. It's amazing. I was away. My husband and I were away at the end of May, and sure enough, thank God, nobody was in our house using the electricity because it was at 0. But this now proves that I now can control more of my energy consumption. Another example, in Westchester, where I live, there's a concerted effort to revamp houses to be standalone, energy-sufficient entities. This helps with heating and cooling through geothermal pumps. And with government incentive, just like with solar panels, many of our neighbors are taking this step to reduce their energy costs and support a greener environment. I also pointed out, traveling from New York, I looked at United Airlines, and sure enough, 2.22 tons of CO2 were emitted to bring me back and forth on that flight from Newark to LA. And incidentally, I thought I was going to be really unique, and then I went to your commissary just now and saw that you already have wooden utensils, so that's really great. But United Airlines has made some committed statements, including offering wooden utensils that do work. And finally, while I was away, I was in Munich, and this is, if you've ever been to the Munich airport, there's this giant space, and that is a giant placard for Audi announcing its new fleet of electronic cars. The motion to push e-vehicles to the forefront will bring the notion of sustainability to the forefront of consumers' mindsets. And the better knowledge and information, consumers and companies can make better choices for themselves. In former times, we'd see a car's gas mileage reflected on the sticker. Now it's carbon emissions that will be catching our eye and making the buying decision. Which all brings me back to the glacier on Mount Kilimanjaro. For now, the glacier still exists. I know because I spent the night in Kaibo's crater right there. You might see those little orange dots. Those are tents. But it is threatened. And we know that climate change impacts our environment, and not for the better. The melting glacier is but one sign. We see changes reflected in rising ocean temperatures and sea levels, in longer, more impactful hurricane and wildfire seasons, all creating social and economic impacts that affect billions of people around the world. Every industry needs to take a stand and make improvements to fight against global warming. The media industry, though relatively small, has an outsized influence to impact the public and other industries to make a difference. I am eager to work with the industry to make a lasting and positive impact. At the end of the day, like everything in our world, the more we are informed and understand, the better we can make choices that impact our planet. Just like we have to fight for social issues, diversity and inclusion, social justice, and basic human rights, we must now include sustainability as a core part of our future. The warnings are here. We're already past the tipping point to reach the 1.5-degree increase, but we have a chance to stop the 2-degree increase and perhaps even reverse it. So I thank you very much for joining me in this session today. And now I will pass the baton to Mick Broderick to talk about how technology is bringing efficiency, cost savings, and yes, sustainability to media tech. Thank you very much.